this is Misty Green, and you're listening to the I Lead Misty Blue podcast, where strategy meets soul and faith finds its voice. Pull up a chair. The table is set. If you listened to the prior episode, The Power of the Pause, then you already know that some of the holiest seasons in our lives are the ones that don't look productive from the outside. See, we're accustomed to recognizing growth only when it's visible, when doors are flying open, when the blessings are flowing, when momentum is building, when something in our lives feels expansive enough to reassure us that we are really moving forward. Yet, anyone who has experienced life enough or walked with God long enough begins to understand that some of the real work and some of God's deepest work happens in seasons where very little seems to be happening at all. And then there are seasons that feel even harder than stillness. There are seasons that feel like reduction. These are the moments when something in your life that once seemed strong and fruitful is suddenly cut back until what remains feels smaller than what once was. Sometimes it's a role that once gave shape to your days that you worked so hard to achieve. And sometimes it's a relationship that once felt so secure and made things feel as though they were in constant blossom. And then possibly it's a dream that seemed to be growing beautifully until, and without warning, it is interrupted in ways you didn't choose and that you cannot fully explain. Those seasons can be deeply unsettling because what feels like loss to us may actually be preservation in the hands of God. And it's unsettling to sit with in that moment that the preservation and the protection is ordained. This is why the image that's created in the book of Daniel, chapter 4, matters so very much. For those of you who may not know the story well, Daniel was living in Babylon. Babylon was a powerful empire that conquered Judah and carried many of God's people into captivity. At the time, Babylon's king, Nebuchadnezzar, had a troubling dream, and he called on Daniel to interpret it. In that dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a magnificent tree that was towering and expansive. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its branches stretched wide enough to shelter living creatures, and its fruit was abundant enough to nourish many. The Bible depicts it as the picture of visible strength, of influence, and of outward flourishment. But then the decree comes from heaven that the tree is to be cut down to a stump. Its branches are to be removed, its leaves are to be stripped away, and its fruit is to be scattered. What seemed immovable, sustainable, and steady is suddenly reduced in a way that feels complete and severe. If the dream ended there, it would sound like judgment alone, like punishment, as though everything had been brought to an immediate end. But the dream doesn't end there. Daniel 4:15 goes on to say, "Nevertheless, leave the stump of its roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and bronze." And see, that word nevertheless is where the whole meaning shifts. That word always gives me pause in scripture because whenever we encounter a nevertheless, we're standing at the threshold between what appears final and what God is still holding inside, His will. It is the same sacred tension that we hear echoed in Gethsemane when Jesus prays, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." In both places, nevertheless marks the moment where pain is not removed, but it is no longer meaningless. In Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the cutting down of the tree sounds devastating at first because everything visible about it is stripped away. The branches that once stretched wide are removed, the leaves are stripped, and the fruit that once nourished others is scattered. What had looked strong and immovable, steady and stable, is suddenly reduced in a way that feels startling and complete. Yet right in the middle of that loss comes the word nevertheless. And that word changes how we understand everything that follows. Scripture tells us that although the tree is cut down, the stump and its roots are to be left in the ground and bound with iron and bronze. See, that means the tree is not abandoned to decay, nor is it discarded as though it would no longer had value. What remains is intentionally preserved. The binding is both restraint and protection, a sign that what has been reduced is still under God's authority and care, and it's still part of his greater purpose. That is what makes this image so powerful for anyone walking through a pause season, because the preserved stump tells us that what looks diminished is not necessarily finished. When God leaves the root in place, he is declaring that life still remains beneath what appears to be lost, and that what has been cut back may still carry a future not yet visible to us. Nebuchadnezzar eventually learns that the tree represents him. His greatness had become swollen with pride, and what looked like strength outwardly had become spiritually dangerous inwardly. God allows him to be humbled, not in order to destroy him, but in order to restore him rightly. The cutting back is correction, but the preserved stump is mercy. And this is not the only place in Scripture where a stump carries holy meaning. In Isaiah chapter 11, another stump appears, this time in a prophecy spoken over God's people. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. To understand that image, we need to know that Jesse was the father of King David. The royal line that once looked powerful had been reduced, diminished, and nearly erased in the eyes of the world. Yet Isaiah says that from what appears cut down, new life will emerge. That prophecy ultimately points to Jesus. Both of these images, the stump in Daniel and the stump in Isaiah, carry the same quiet reassurance. When God leaves something rooted, he is not finished with it. In Daniel, the preserved stump becomes a sign that mercy is still present, even in a season of humbling. While in Isaiah, the stump becomes the place from which new life begins again. One story reminds us that God can hold us through reduction without abandoning us, and the other reminds us that what appears diminished may still become the beginning of restoration. That is why the pause seasons can be so difficult to interpret while we're living inside of them. When life grows quiet, we often assume something has ended. When something is cut back, our first instinct is to grieve what is missing rather than to consider what God may still be protecting beneath the surface. So much of his work happens in hidden places where roots deepen long before branches ever appear again. What feels invisible to us is not inactive to God. And perhaps that is where some people find themselves right now, in a season that feels smaller than the one before it, standing where something meaningful once flourished and wondering why it had to be reduced at all. If that is where you are, it may help to remember that smaller doesn't mean forsaken, and reduced doesn't mean ruined. Sometimes what has been cut back in your life is not being taken from you as punishment, but preserved in a quieter form until the time is right for growth to return. Because God is never careless with roots. If he left the stump, it is because he's not finished. And if he's not finished, then what feels quiet now may one day become the place from which your strongest growth emerges. So if this is your stump season, don't rush to call it failure. Sit gently in the pause. Let the nevertheless of God steady your heart. And trust that the one who preserves roots always knows what he intends to restore. This is Misty Green, and you've been listening to the I Lead Misty Blue podcast, where strategy meets soul and faith finds its voice. If this conversation met you in a tender place today, stay connected here, subscribe, join the community, and share this episode with someone who may need the reminder that what feels cut back is not always lost.